Hi, this is Truman. I like to understand how things work, and today we're going to talk about Google. Google is one of the largest and the most well-known companies in the world. You and I use their products and services from Gmail, Google Maps, Google Drive to search engine. In 2021, Google is on track to make more than $250 billion of revenue, and its current market capitalization is more than $2 trillion. But for such a large company like Google, as investment, however, do you know how they make money? What makes Google such a unique and also boring company? What are the most strategically important assets at Google? In this video clip, we are going to cover all these areas about this mysterious and well-known company called Google. So first, let's talk about how does Google make money by its revenue segments. So Google breaks down its revenue into three segments. The first one is Google Services, the second one is Google Cloud, and the last one is what Google calls Other Bets. So as you can see here, Google makes more than 90% of its revenue from the Google Services and only 7% from Google Cloud. So the obvious question you ask is, what is on earth inside this Google Services? So fortunately, Google does provide more clarity into that. So specifically within the Google Services, it has one segment called Google Ads and the other segment called Others. So Google Ads is basically how Google makes most of its money by letting you use their search engine, Gmail, Google Maps, all these products for free. And then inside this Others is mostly the hardware business at Google. So for example, if you buy a Pixel phone, that goes into the hardware revenue at Google, which is what Google called Others. And it's not really big, it's a very small percentage of what Google does. That's why it's all bundled into these other segments. Now, Google Ads is still pretty vague, but fortunately, Google does give you more clarity. And if you want to drill one level deeper, you are able to see within Google Ads, first you have the search ads. That is by far the most and the largest revenue source at Google. That is basically when you search something from a ticket to a restaurant, Google will push some advertisements in front of you within the search results. That is how Google makes the most money from the advertisers. The second one is YouTube. So if this is something new to you, that definitely tells you don't know enough about Google. YouTube is actually owned 100% by Google, and that is actually a pretty important and strategic asset within Google. And so far it's making about 11% of the total revenue at Google, with search as being the largest at more than 50%. So as you can see, search is still doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and that's where Google started. That's the only thing Google did if you look at the company 10-15 years ago, and so far today it's still close to 60% of what Google does in terms of revenue contribution. And then the other segment within the ads category is what Google calls network. This is basically when you have a website on your own, you are able to allow Google to display some of the ads on a website. And whenever you see someone click into the ads or even just look at the ads for more than a second, Google is able to tell how long you stay on the ads, and that's how they charge by impressions. The advertisers will pay to Google, and then you are able to get a share of that revenue from Google. So this is what Google called network. It's basically all the partners, all the affiliate companies that work with Google, and together they form an ecosystem of companies that display ads on behalf of Google. So when it comes to how Google makes money, what is that one thing we all need to remember? And that is, Google is by far the most successful company that gives you all the products for free. So you can use Gmail, Google Maps, search, all these things for free, but Google is able to still monetize from your usage. So as a user, you are not contributing any revenue to Google. But I think the greatest innovation at a company like Google is the ability to create a brand new business model by just giving the products for free for people to use. So the business logic is basically, as long as these free products will stay free and they will get better 1 year after the other, and then the usage, the engagement of these products are still growing and increasing over time. As long as that is the case, Google is able to sell all these usage to the advertisers, and then these advertisers will pay Google to promote their products. And you don't see this kind of business model that is free for individuals to use and then make money from enterprise clients very often in these days. You basically just got Facebook, television companies, and that's it. And also it's very interesting to see what is the perception versus the reality. So the perception is whenever you read about Google, you see all these headlines about Waymo, which is the autonomous vehicle division, and that is included in the other bets. But if you look at the revenue Google gets from the other bets category, it's close to zero. So Google doesn't really make any money from all these other bets, from Waymo to DeepMind, which is another category inside other bets, and that's a very, very popular headline inside the news media world. But that's not really how Google makes money. So that is the reality, which is how Google makes money is in the pretty boring areas. You don't really read how search is doing, how Google network is doing. So all of these things are pretty far away from the perception, but in reality, that's how Google makes most of its money. And that's actually another interesting observation here. That is, people talk about big trends. But the key is whether you are monetizing as a company that big trend or not. So in the case of Google here, the trend has been ongoing for the last 10-15 years. That is the switch from traditional media into digital media. So traditional media will be newspaper, magazines, billboards, so the physical advertising world, whereas the digital media will be things like Google, Facebook, and Twitter. So even though that trend has been the case for more than a decade, but as you can see here, even for a large company like Google, who makes more than $200 billion of revenue each year, it's still able to grow at an impressive 41%. So that trend is definitely accelerating. And if you look at the total mix of traditional media versus digital media, that trend will continue. So as long as Google keeps innovation ongoing and bringing more products that people keep loving to use, Google is able to monetize that big trend continuously going forward. So now you have 41%, which is the total growth rate for Google. What is each business line growing? So as you can see here, it's pretty consistent across the board, except this other category, which is mostly hardware, and within which Pixel, the smartphone, is a big part of that. But putting that aside, all the other areas are growing at a pretty impressive more than 40%. So you got search ads growing 44%, YouTube ads growing 43%, the network ads is growing at 40%, and then finally cloud is growing at 45%. And specifically for cloud, even though it's only about 7-8% of Google's business revenue, but it's growing actually the fastest. And what's the cloud? So cloud is actually quite similar to Amazon AWS and Microsoft Azure, but it's a much smaller business at Google. The most value add of the cloud business at Google is to sell to developers. So things like when you develop an app within the Android ecosystem, Google is then selling all these ancillary services, from data storage to different development tools to different monitoring tools. So we at Gen Impact, we're actually using a couple of tools from Google, and we pay a fee based on usage. So Google is able to monetize from the developer community. And actually, as a matter of fact, the fees we pay to Google is quite minimal, is almost nothing. So that is the philosophy at Google, which is to give you all these products to as free as possible, and then it's basically a volume game. So as many people as possible start to use those products and services, and then Google is able to monetize those usage by other innovative ways, such as advertising. And the other part of the cloud business is basically all the tools as a company uses and then pays for Google. So for example, we at Gen Impact, we use the Gmail service at Google, which Google called Workspace. And then we pay based on the number of team members we have. So that's how Google is able to make money from enterprise clients within the cloud business. And that is once again growing at an impressive 45%. So you can see clearly people are using more of Google's products as enterprise clients as well. So Google is no longer just making revenue from the advertisers, but they're also able to monetize more and more from their enterprise clients who uses Google's technology. So that's our analysis on Google. Make sure to check back and watch our part 2. In part 2, we're going to include more interesting insights, such as what makes Google one of the greatest companies in the world, what it's investing for the future, and some of Google's most competitive advantages over other large tech companies such as Apple.